My name is Emily Carter, and I was 18 years old the day I found out who really loved me. I grew up in a small Midwestern town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest news of the week was whose corn was taller. I had spent my whole life dreaming of leaving that town for a top university. Not because I hated it there, but because I wanted more. I studied harder than anyone I knew. I kept my grades near perfect. I picked up scholarships one by one, stacking them like bricks toward a future I could almost taste. On weekends, I worked at a small cafe downtown, pouring coffee for tired truckers and tired teachers, saving every dollar I could. My younger brother Jake was 16, and from as far back as I can remember, he could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. If I brought home a 92 on a test, my mother would ask why it wasn't a 95. If Jake brought home a 68, my father would say the teacher must not have explained it well. It was never said out loud, not directly, but I felt it in 1,000 small ways, the way you feel a draft in an old house. Jake got a brand new gaming PC for his birthday one year. I had saved up and bought myself a used laptop with a cracked corner, and I was grateful for it. When Jake crashed the family car backing out of the driveway, somehow, by the end of the conversation, it became my fault for leaving my shoes by the garage door. A distraction, they said. I learned early to just accept it, to keep the peace, to make myself smaller so the house could stay quiet. There was only one person who ever seemed to notice, my grandmother, Eleanor. She never made a scene about it. She never argued with my parents in front of me, but she watched. She always watched. And every time I gave something up, every time I swallowed something unfair, I would catch her eyes across the room, soft and knowing, like she was quietly writing it all down somewhere I couldn't see. On the night of my 18th birthday, our house was full. Nearly 20 relatives had packed into the living room and spilled into the kitchen, plates balanced on knees, kids running between legs, the usual noise of a big family gathering. I expected the evening to go the way it always did. Cake, a few toasts, maybe an embarrassing story about me as a baby. Then my grandmother stood up. The room quieted the way rooms do when someone older and respected rises to speak. I assumed she was going to give one of her sentimental little toasts, the kind where she'd tear up talking about how fast I'd grown. Instead, she looked at me and said, slowly, deliberately, "I've waited 18 years for this day." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, placing it gently in my hands. Inside was a letter, written in her careful handwriting, words I would read 100 times over the following weeks. But that wasn't all. She handed me a second envelope, thicker, official. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a certified bank document, a college trust established years earlier, in my name. $100,000. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. I started crying before I even understood what I was reading. My grandmother pulled me into a hug, and around us, relatives began to clap. A slow, stunned applause that grew louder as the shock wore off. My parents smiled too, but I remember now, looking back, that their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. And from somewhere near the back of the room, I heard my brother mutter, just loud enough, "Must be nice." I didn't notice it at the time. I was too happy, too overwhelmed. But my grandmother noticed. My grandmother always noticed. I woke up the next morning happier than I had ever been in my life. I stayed in bed for a while, just staring at the ceiling, letting myself imagine it. Dorm rooms, campus quads, a future that suddenly felt wide open instead of narrow and uncertain. I grabbed my laptop and started looking up university housing before I'd even brushed my teeth. There was a knock at my door. My father's knock. 3 sharp raps, followed by him stepping in without waiting for an answer. His voice was flat, colder than I'd heard it in a long time. He closed the door behind him, which he never did. A moment later, my mother came and sat on the edge of my bed too. I remember thinking it was strange, the two of them together like that, like they were about to deliver bad news about someone's health. Instead, my father said the sentence that would end up changing the entire shape of my life. "We need to discuss what you're going to do with our money." I blinked at him. "Our?" He didn't flinch. He and my mother had already worked it out between themselves, apparently, because he began listing it off like a grocery list. His business had debts that needed clearing. There were credit cards piling up interest. They'd been wanting to redo the kitchen for years. Jake's private school tuition was coming due. They'd been talking about a family vacation, somewhere warm, somewhere they deserved after everything they'd sacrificed. And the SUV in the driveway was getting old. And college? Well, I had scholarships, didn't I? Those would be enough. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that Grandma had given the money to me. My father's expression didn't change at all. "Everything children own belongs to the family," he said, like it was a fact as plain as the color of the sky. I refused, politely at first because that was how I'd been trained to handle every disagreement in that house, softly, carefully, so as not to upset anyone. But I refused. The silence that followed was heavier than any I'd felt in that house before. My father's face shifted, something cold settling behind his eyes. "You'll regret this," he said, and left the room. Over the following week, the house I had grown up in became a place I barely recognized. My parents stopped speaking to me directly, communicating only through pointed comments at dinner, or not communicating at all. Meals became silent, tense affairs where the only sound was forks against plates. The groceries I liked stopped appearing in the pantry. The Wi-Fi password changed overnight, and no one offered to give it to me. My phone plan, which my parents had always paid for, was suddenly canceled. And then, one afternoon, I came home to find my bedroom door had been taken off its hinges entirely. My father's explanation was simple and chilling. There were no secrets in this family anymore. Then the calls started. My Aunt Linda phoned to remind me how much my parents had sacrificed for me over the years, her voice dripping with disappointment. My Uncle Steve told me, almost cheerfully, that money changes people, as if I were the one who had changed. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly had opinions about my character. Slowly, quietly, I started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I owed them more than I thought. I went to my grandmother's house in tears one afternoon, half expecting her to be shocked at what was happening. She wasn't. She simply looked at me with a kind of tired patience and said, "It happened exactly when I expected." I didn't understand what she meant. So she told me. Years before I was born and for years after, my parents had come to her again and again, borrowing money they promised to repay. They never did. My grandfather had left my grandmother a comfortable inheritance when he passed, enough to live on for the rest of her life without worry. Most of it had quietly disappeared, swallowed up bailing my parents out of one financial hole after another. Eventually, my grandmother had done something she'd never done before. She said no. And from that day forward, something in my parents had curdled toward her, a resentment that never really went away. She opened a drawer in her side table and pulled out a folder of documents. She explained patiently that the money she'd given me wasn't sitting in some ordinary account my parents could pressure me into signing over. It was inside an irrevocable trust. I couldn't accidentally lose it, and more importantly, my parents could not touch it. No one but me had any claim to it at all. Her attorney, she told me, had structured it that way years ago because in some part of her heart, she had expected exactly this kind of confrontation to happen someday. Then she told me something else, something that made my stomach turn. When I was 15, my parents had come to her secretly and asked her to release the college money early, years before I would even graduate high school. She had refused. She never told me. Not until that day, because she hadn't wanted to poison how I saw my own parents before I had to. Back home, things only grew worse. My father started demanding I pay rent if I intended to keep living under his roof. My mother told me I should be contributing to utilities like an adult, apparently overnight forgetting I was still finishing my final year of high school. Jake, emboldened by the tension in the house, started mocking me daily, calling me the family's cash cow, laughing when I flinched. Then, one afternoon, I came home from my shift at the cafe to find the locks had been changed. My belongings, everything I owned, had been stuffed into black trash bags and left sitting on the porch like garbage waiting for pickup. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the bags, feeling something inside me go very still and very calm. Then I called my grandmother. She opened her door before I even finished knocking, like she'd been waiting. She didn't ask a single question. She just pulled me inside, sat me down at her kitchen table, and made me my favorite dinner, the same meal she used to make when I was small and scraped my knee or had a bad day at school. For the first time in weeks, maybe the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I felt safe. My parents, of course, told a different story to anyone who would listen. According to them, I had abandoned my family. I had stolen money from them. I had manipulated a vulnerable old woman into cutting them out. I was greedy, ungrateful, cold. The rumors spread through our small town faster than I could have imagined, reaching even the people at church, people who used to smile and wave at me every Sunday and now looked at me with narrowed, judging eyes. I said nothing in response to any of it. My grandmother told me, "Truth doesn't need to shout." And I held on to that, even on the nights it was hardest to believe. A few weeks later, my grandmother invited the entire family to Sunday dinner. Everyone came, my parents included, clearly expecting that she had called the gathering to pressure me into finally giving in. I could see it in the satisfied look on my father's face as he walked through her door. Instead, my grandmother stood at the head of the table with a folder in her hands. Calmly, without raising her voice even once, she began to lay out everything inside it. Bank statements going back years, records of loans given and never repaid, signed promises to pay her back that had long since been broken, text messages and letters, one after another, asking for money, always more money. One by one in front of everyone, every lie my parents had spread about me quietly fell apart. Then she delivered one final piece of news, something even I hadn't known was coming. Because of how my parents had behaved, she had changed her will. I would be the executor of her estate. Her inheritance, whatever remained of it, would bypass my parents entirely and come to me. The room went absolutely silent, the same silence I remembered from my birthday party, except this time it wasn't filled with joy. My father exploded, his face red, accusing my grandmother of tearing the family apart with her own hands. My grandmother didn't raise her voice to match his. She simply looked at him and said, "No, greed destroyed this family." My parents left that night, and a handful of relatives followed them out the door in solidarity. But most stayed. Several came to me afterward, quietly, awkwardly, to apologize for believing the things they'd heard. 5 years passed. I graduated from college with honors, a degree I'd worked myself ragged for, and I walked straight into a high-paying engineering job I'd dreamed about since I was young. I carried no student debt at all because my grandmother's gift had covered every bit of it. Tuition, housing, books, all of it. Jake, meanwhile, dropped out of college after a single semester and had struggled to find steady footing ever since. My parents continued dealing with the very financial problems they'd hoped my trust fund would solve, problems that had never really been about me at all. The first big purchase I made with my own money, once I was finally standing on my own 2 feet, was a small cottage by a lake for my grandmother, the kind of place she used to point at in magazines and say she'd love to own someday. One evening, not long after she moved in, we sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink low over the water, the sky turning every shade of orange and pink. She smiled at me and said, "Money can disappear. A good education stays with you forever." Sitting there beside her, I finally understood what she meant. The greatest gift she had ever given me wasn't the $100,000 in that envelope. It was the simple, unshakable fact that someone had believed in me enough to protect my future, even when the people who were supposed to protect me most had tried to take it away. The day my parents demanded my grandmother's gift, I thought I was losing my family. Looking back now, I understand I wasn't losing anything at all. I was simply discovering, for the first time, who truly loved me.